Hello, it's Helen from Journal with Purpose and welcome back to my channel. I really hope that you're doing okay. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you how I use my journal to tackle negative thoughts and feelings that I'm having. And it's something, I guess, particularly over the last year that I've really wanted to get on top of, because I can certainly talk to people about those thoughts, but often I just need to get them out of my head and onto paper, and then start finding ways to think about all of those things from a different perspective. So that's what I'm going to be sharing today, and I really hope that you enjoy it and find it useful. This month on Patreon, I shared some journal prompts, and I'm going to be using those today. One of them was about tackling those negative thoughts and behaviours, and the other prompt I'm going to be working on is using some of my kind of neglected art and journaling supplies. So things that I really like but I don't use nearly often enough, often because they're quite messy supplies. So I'm going to be getting really messy and sharing something a bit different in this video, so that I go through the process of getting those negative thoughts out and then covering them up with loads of mess. It's a lot of fun, and then starting to write things out in a much happier way. So I really hope that you enjoy the video and that it gives you some lovely ideas to use in your own journal. I'm going to start off by sharing some of the products I think I might be using whilst making these pages. So these are all things that I don't use nearly often enough, and I'm going to get really nice and messy and have a play in my journals to make sure it's a really fun experience. So one of the first products are these Faber Castell Gelatos. They're kind of like waxy crayons, and I used them a lot at one point and then put them away and haven't used them much again. I'm going to very likely be using some acrylic paints, and these ones are from Royal Talens in their Amsterdam Standard series, and I love their acrylic paints. I've got a metallic silver acrylic paint there that I might use, a makeup sponge for applying the paint, my brayer, which you can see has been very well used previously, and my jelly printing plate. And I love using this, but again, it's quite messy. I don't get it out often enough, so I'm going to play with that. Possibly some Posca paint markers, some gesso, and I'm also thinking maybe these Stabilo Woody's pencils. If you follow me on Instagram, you might well have seen me use these when I work on on their campaigns with Cult Pens for Woody's windows. They're amazing for using on glass, and they wipe off really easily, but they're also a great chunky size for doing kind of big scrawls, and I want to really let go on these journal pages, let some things out and just kind of be a bit freer, and things like that you can't be particularly tidy with them, so I think they'll be great for this. And I'm going to use all of these, which I'm only slightly worried about. I've got my cover here from Start Bay Notebooks, and I'm going to use them in my dotted journal from London Gifties. And I've used lots of watercolour and stamping in here, but not really kind of more mixed media things. But it's nice thick paper, almost like card, so I'm hoping it will be absolutely fine. You definitely don't need to have any of these things at all to follow along with what I'm doing. I'm going to give lots of other ideas for ways that you can cover up one of the pages, which is what I'll be doing. But so I hope you really enjoy seeing something a little bit different. As I mentioned, I'm going to be using an A5 dotted journal from London Gifties, which I keep inside this paisley etched cover from Start Bay Notebooks. And I'm going to be using quite a lot of heavy mixed media on my journal pages, and I'm happy to report that by the end absolutely nothing seeped through or bled through onto other pages, but it's definitely worth bearing in mind what kind of paper thickness and quality you've got in your journal, before you start adding acrylic paints and lots of heavy media. The first thing that I'm going to do is use this left-hand page to let out all of my negative thoughts and feelings. And I'm using a gel pen for this because I'm not worried at all if it smudges. This is something I'm going to want to get out of my system and then cover up. So I'm including kind of lots of worries about how the world is at the moment and everything that's going on. But also there's lots in there about self-doubt, which is something that I come across a lot personally, where I'm always second-guessing myself, worried that the things I'm doing aren't good enough. And it's when I get into that negative spiral of thinking that I find these pages so useful. And it just breaks that habit for me, writing them down and recognising the kinds of things that I'm actually saying to myself. Of course, it's entirely up to you how much or how little you write on these pages, but I'd say just keep going until you feel that you've got those main things out of your system and onto paper. And now I'm going to move on to the really fun and therapeutic part of covering up all of those negative thoughts. And I'm using some wooden block stamps from London Gifties with some black StazOn ink. And I'm going to use that to basically start the process of completely obliterating that writing. I'm going to be adding lots and lots of layers to this left-hand page, so I'm not at all worried about where I'm placing my stamps or how things are looking at all. Once I've added the paint, there'll be little bits of the black ink from the stamps peeking through in different places, but not enough to actually know how things were laid out. So I just use this to start having fun and starting to just make sure all of that writing is hidden. The next thing I'm going to do is pick some Stabilo woody pencils. And I know the colour palette that I want to use is going to be predominantly blues, blacks and whites. And I'm going to use these to just start kind of mark making, scribbling, anything on my page which just feels good. I'm really not giving it any thought. I'm just letting myself kind of play and get messy. I think that one of the reasons I find this so therapeutic is usually I try and be quite tidy in my journals, and this is my chance to just absolutely let loose and do whatever comes to mind. I'm now going to do more or less exactly the same thing again using these Faber Castell Gelatos. And one of the fun things you can do with these is smudge them in with your fingers. And again, that felt really great and satisfying to do. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that it doesn't matter if you're using completely different products to me. The most important part that I find when doing this kind of exercise is just getting all of those thoughts out, covering them up, and then moving on to something more positive. So other options you could think of is gluing some decorative paper over the top of your writing, or creating a collage, using some nice deep colours of pens or pencils, or you could even try a few layers of a deep coloured watercolour paint. I've previously printed off positive quotes off the internet and I've glued those on top too, and anything like that will work really well. I have to say that I really enjoyed the process of just adding those scribbles, circles, lines, and getting my fingers really messy. It felt so good, and I felt an awful lot lighter by the time I'd finished creating these pages. As you can see at the moment, I'm just using my fingers to smudge those gelatos and make sure that I've made a complete mess. Next, I'm going to move on to doing some jelly plate printing. And despite the fact I haven't done this for a while, it's actually one of my favourite things to do to create backgrounds in my art journal. I'm using 3 different colours of acrylic paint, and these are from Royal Talons. So I'm using a light and dark shade of blue and also a white. And I'm going to add 9 drops of paint onto my jelly plate. I'm now going to use my brayer to start spreading that paint around. And I like to make sure that there's still some definition between each of the colours, so they don't mix entirely, but they are just spread out across that whole square. Before I start transferring that paint onto my journal page, I want to make sure that I've protected the pages underneath and the one on the right hand side. So I'm using some old pieces of paper for this, and then I'm going to use a thin strip of washi tape to hold down a sheet on the right hand side as well. That's just to make sure that when I'm pushing that jelly plate down, that I'm not getting any of that paint onto the right hand page. I'll be coming back and adding some writing and decoration to that later. Now that the paper is in place, I'm going to start using my jelly plate to transfer the paint. So I'm going to turn it over, and this can get messy, but that's fine, I love that. And just start pressing it down with my fingers in a couple of places on my page. And that can leave you with a really lovely pattern of paint. You could also make some extra marks on your jelly plate by using the end of a paintbrush or stamp or a stencil. One of the things I really like about this is that it gives you a lovely quick background, but because the paint's still thin, you can see some of the layers peeking up from underneath. And also each time you do it, it's going to look completely different. And I never like to waste any of the paint that's on my jelly plate. So I'm now opening up my art journal, and this is the Dilutions brand. And I'm going to get to my next blank pages and just make sure that I'm making the most of that paint. And it gives me a really lovely background, which will be there when I'm ready to next work in my art journal. Jelly plates aren't particularly cheap, but if you like playing around with acrylic paint and creating backgrounds, I think you'll probably find it's one of those things that you use time and time again. I'm now going to use my brayer to just spread some of that paint out a little on my page. Once I'd tidied everything away, I used a heat tool to quickly dry off that first journal page to make sure that the layer of paint was completely dry. The next thing I'm going to do is add some stenciling on top, and for this I'm going to use some black acrylic paint which I'm squeezing out onto an old ceramic plate. And I've got a stencil which is many years old now. I think I bought it from a craft store, and I really like the old vintagey kind of text look on there. And I'm going to use a makeup sponge to gently dab some paint through that stencil. And I'm just going to add that in various places across my page. If you use acrylic paint for stenciling in your journals, it's worth dabbing off a lot of the paint before you start applying it through the stencil. Because if it's too wet, it quite easily kind of seeps out and bleeds into places that you might not want it to be. I really hope that you're enjoying seeing something a bit different from me. I don't tend to share much of my art journaling pages or process, but this just felt like the perfect activity for me to cover up all of those negative thoughts. The next thing that I'm going to do is add some of that silver metallic paint to my page, and for this I'm using one of these old paint brushes. I used to take these around with me when I did in-person journaling workshops, so they're really handy to use when I'm doing art journaling. And I'm just going to add a few splashes of that colour on my page. I was so pleased that I set the challenge over on Patreon for people to dig out their supplies that they hadn't been using in a while, because it really encouraged me to have a look through my stash and break out of my comfort zone a little bit and try something that I haven't done in quite a while. If you do decide to carry out this kind of journaling activity, I'd absolutely love it if you shared it with me over on Instagram and tag me as Journal with Purpose on your photo. Having decided that I wasn't quite messy enough at this stage, I decided to use some of the white acrylic paint, and I'm going to use my fingers to apply that to the edges of the page. And I really like doing this because it picks up some of the texture from all of the other paint marks below it. So I'm just going in circular motions, and I'll do that around all four edges. If you do have some negative thoughts swirling around in your head, I hope that you find this process as therapeutic as I did, to just add lots of layers on top of that writing, whether it be layers of paint, old book pages, tags, any kinds of decoration that you want. But it's so nice for me knowing that that's there in my journal, but hidden from view, and for me it's done its job. I'm now going to add a quote to that page, and for this I'm going to use a black Posca paint pen. The quote that I'm going to add is, "I'm perfect just as I am." And I'm writing that so that I've got a reminder that rather than worrying about all the things that I think aren't quite right, that I'm not doing well enough, that other people are doing better, that actually it's all of our differences and our quirks that make us exactly who we should be. So I'm going to tear that quote out for including on that page. Once I'm happy with where I want the quote to go, I'm going to use some PVA glue to stick it down. If you prefer, you could definitely print a quote off the internet or add some kind of focal image to this type of page. I decided to keep it simple because I just wanted that one powerful reminder there. The next thing I'm going to do is outline my quote, and for this I'm using a Stabilo aquarellable pencil, and these are great fun to use because they're water soluble, so once you add some water you can get a really lovely smudgy kind of effect. So as you can see here, I'm using a water brush and I'm running that along the outside of the quote to make sure that that pencil dissolves really nicely and gives a bold black outline. Once I was done with that, I decided to add just a few other decorative elements on top of this page, and I'm going to be using that black Posca paint pen again, and I'm going to use that to add some really loose circles on my page. Next, I decided to use my black gelatos again, and I'm going to rub these around the outside of the page, and I'm then smudging that with my fingers. It's just because I felt like I wanted a slightly stronger border around this page. But just remember, just add as much or as little as you want. I really just felt so good doing all of this that I really spent quite a lot of time on these pages, just adding more and more layers until I felt completely relaxed and ready to start thinking about much more positive kinds of thoughts. I'm now using my black Posca paint pen again to add some little dot details in the white paint. Finally, on this left-hand page, I'm using my white gelatos inside those circles that I've just created, and then I'm going to add some water on top, which helps dilute them but actually seems to make the gelatos more vibrant. Now that I'm finally feeling that that page is done, I'm ready to move on to much more positive things. I completely lost myself in that process and it felt wonderful. So on the right hand page, I'm going to use some blue washi tape from London Gifties and add a strip along that right edge. Next, I'm going to add 3 stickers to my page, and I believe these are Paper Dolls brand, and I really liked these images of the girls that I chose. I thought they looked quite happy and upbeat, and that's what I want to represent on this right-hand page. And this is much more my usual style of journaling, with a few simple decorations and lots of white space for writing. Next up, I'm going to add a heading to the top of my page, and for this I'm using a Tombow Fudenosuke brush pen with a firm nib. And the heading that I'm writing is Positive Thoughts, and I'll be sharing with you in a moment the sorts of things that I'm going to be writing down here. At the bottom of my journal page, I'm going to add a quote, and the one I'll be writing out is "Attitude is a little thing that makes a big difference." And I really wanted these pages to be something that were just entirely positive when I looked at them, so that I could read back through them to make sure that I was in the right mindset and focusing on positivity. Before I covered up my left-hand page, which I probably should have mentioned earlier, I took a quick copy of the things that I was writing down, certainly not to keep because I've already got rid of it, but to make sure that I could rephrase those thoughts in a more positive way. So the things I'm writing down on this page are: dreams are so important, they make us unique. I'm being brave in following mine. Some things will go better than others, that's okay. Every outcome is an opportunity to learn. I'm making better choices to help improve my physical and mental health. I have lots of imperfections, we all do. They're what makes life interesting. Nothing is safe, at least I'm spending my time doing things that I love. And my life is full of the important things. I'm surrounded by family, love, laughter and creativity. And this felt like a much better way to be thinking and trying to focus my thoughts. I really hope that you've enjoyed watching this video and that maybe it's given you some ideas that you can use in your own journal. If you've got any questions or comments, as always, please do leave them down below. I also want to say a huge thank you to everybody who's supporting me over on Patreon. It means the absolute world to me. Thank you ever so much for watching, and I look forward to speaking with you really soon in my next video.